Commonwealth's attorneys and I have concluded that the NCAA sanctions were overreaching and unlawful.
Someone's got to develop a product that you and I as a consumer are going to want to buy.
The country needs a comprehensive energy plan.
Hello and welcome to this edition of For the Record. Our guest today, U.S. Senator Pat Toomey. Senator Toomey, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Well, there's a lot of things going on in Washington, D.C., and we can't think of a better person to discuss all of those problems than you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
Let's start off with what was heading our way at Christmas time, that fiscal cliff, the sequester.
Yeah.
A lot of people have a lot of misconception about what the sequester really is. Can you go into some detail about what it really is?
And how long do we have?
We have 7 minutes in this segment.
Yeah. Well, you may recall back in 2011, we reached an impasse about whether or not to raise the debt ceiling and by how much. The President Obama, of course, wanted more borrowing authority to run up more debt and didn't want to do anything about spending. But some of us in Congress insisted that we needed to do something about the spending, which is out of control in Washington and has been. I actually voted against this deal because I didn't think it did enough to bring spending under control, but at least it did begin the process.
Sure.
So I think of it in two parts. The first part was automatic across-the-board cuts in most parts of government, but not all, for the fiscal year that we're in now, which ends on September 30th. After that, for the next 9 years, there are spending caps that are in place. And the discretionary part of our federal budget, which is about 40% of all federal spending, and that's the part that Congress appropriates year in and year out, that will be subject to those limits, established as absolute dollar caps. Now, they grow over time, but they don't grow as rapidly as they were scheduled to grow. So, in a technical sense, the sequester really only refers to the remainder of this fiscal year. And the difference between the sequester and the caps is that the sequester kind of applies, as I said earlier, almost across the board. There are some exceptions. Whereas the caps are much more flexible in their nature. The Congress can decide how to spend the various categories as long as they don't add up to a number above the cap.
Okay.
And the sequester is more of a blunt instrument in the sense that it doesn't give quite as much flexibility as it should, although there is some flexibility.
And are the actual cuts in actual reduction, or is it just baseline and a reduction in the amount of growth?
Steve, this is all reduction in the rate of growth. So a little bit of context, we have a federal government, the spending of which has grown by 100% in the last 12 years. The total size of the federal government has doubled 12 years. The cuts of the sequester are about 2.5% from that huge bloated level. And assuming the sequester remains in force and we achieve the savings, even if we do them in a slightly better fashion,
right,
at the end of this fiscal year, we still will have spent more money than we spent last year.
One of the things that the White House certainly was talking about was all this peril that's going on about everybody. They put it all in the Defense Department. You can't have the Blue Angels fly over anymore. They've stopped White House tours.
Yeah.
And they talked about what this apocalypse financially is going to happen.
Right.
The stock market today, as we tape this show, is over 15,000.
Right, well over.
So, I mean, it really has not been as bad as the doom and gloom that was presented.
Yeah, in my view, it was always ridiculous to suggest that trimming a little tiny bit from a hugely bloated federal government was going to devastate the economy. The idea that the economy depends on a massive and ever-growing government is ridiculous. It's exactly the opposite. In fact, if we trimmed the government and had a leaner, more responsible, more limited government, we'd have a much stronger private economy, in my view. So that was just wrong. But the administration, I think they did feel the need to try to make it appear as though this would be very disruptive and even catastrophic. Because after all, their goal is to continue to grow government. Government's not nearly as big as they'd like it to be. And so if the American people witness a modest reduction in the rate of growth of government and everything's fine, well, then they may be okay with trimming some more. So that's why I think the administration really oversold the notion that the sequester was going to be devastating. You know, they did this in particular with the FAA budget. As you may recall, they threatened, in fact, started to impose layoffs of air traffic controllers and shutting down air traffic towers. What was particularly galling to me about that is if you look at the FAA budget after the sequester, there was still more money to spend than what the president asked for in his budget submission for the FAA. So it was a contrived and manufactured crisis. Fortunately, the American people weren't buying it, and so the administration ended up basically backing down. We've agreed to shift some of the cuts a little bit so that the lowest priorities and the redundant and the duplicative programs get cut the most. We haven't done that throughout all of government as we should, but at least we've done it with FAA and some other areas. We're going to get through the sequester.
One of the good things about the sequester, all the IRS agents had last Friday off. Is that not correct?
I wish they could take off more time than that.
Well, let's go right into that.
Yeah, sure.
The newest thing now, the next scandal, I guess, it was the IRS looking at certain groups and their tax status. Can you go? You're actually going to be on your finance committee oversees that.
That's right. Well, so under the existing law, if you are essentially advocates for a certain policy, so you might advocate for any number of, could be agricultural policy or economic policy or trade, anything. It makes sense a lot of times to form a corporation, but you're not in the business of making money, you don't sell anything.
Right.
And so you register as a not-for-profit because you have no intention of making profits, right, and you'll never distribute any money to any shareholders. This has always been the case. There's been this category of entity for many decades. What the IRS decided to do, we think sometime in 2010, was to look to systematically search out organizations that by virtue of the title, it sounded like they were conservative. They might have Tea Party in the title, or it might say Patriot, or it might say limited government, or some other buzzwords that people think of as conservative.
Right.
And that those applications would be subject to a much more aggressive and rigorous scrutiny, including posing ridiculous and unreasonable questions like, give us the name of every person in your organization and every speech they've ever given. We'll take the text in a 12-point font. I mean, just crazy things, right? And it was all for the purpose of denying them the status so that they couldn't operate. So it's hard to imagine that this happened by accident and that this wasn't politically motivated, since it applied exclusively to conservative organizations. There's plenty of center-left and liberal organizations that apply for and get this status. And this is very, very disturbing when the IRS, the agency that we entrust with very personal financial information for every single American virtually, that they would choose to politicize an aspect of their work this way is very, very disturbing. And we haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet, Steve.
That's a good stopping point for us, Senator. When we come back, more with Senator Pat Toomey. You're watching For the Record on WHVL. Welcome back to For the Record. Our guest is Senator Pat Toomey. Senator, we stopped we were talking about the IRS scandal that's going on right now. And there were many groups that the IRS targeted, not just Patriots or Tea Party, also religious groups were looked at as well, correct? Where do we go from here in terms of oversight?
Well, the Finance Committee, on which I sit in the Senate, has jurisdiction over this. And we had a hearing where we brought in the immediate past commissioner and the current acting commissioner, who's tendered.
Which, by the way, was not me.
I discovered that was a different Steve Miller. That's true.
Yes,
yeah. The non-answers to questions was appalling. Basically, it was many variations on, I have no idea. So we got no answers from them. We have this woman, Lois Lerner, who is a mid-level executive in the area that oversees this very function of approving these applications. She, as you know, pleaded the fifth. When I asked Steve Miller, who made the decision that just conservative groups would be subject to this extra scrutiny, he said, you know, I don't know the name, but I think we have that name somewhere, but I don't have that. And then it was discontinued, by the way, and then it was resumed.
Right.
So this, you know, it's just hard to believe this is all an innocent mistake. I want to call the people who actually made these decisions before this committee and get some answers.
So the Senate Finance Committee, which you were on, and also Senator Casey, is it unusual for both senators from one state to be on the same committee?
It is, actually. There's one other state that shares that distinction on the Finance Committee, and it is neighboring Ohio.
Excellent. And also two House committees are also investigating the IRS at the same time. So do you think because it's in both chambers, could that be created a joint committee of some kind to oversee this one?
We might at some point. Here, right now the House is pursuing this as they should. So far, the Senate Finance Committee, which is controlled by Max Baucus, the chairman, who's a Democrat, to his credit, he realizes that this is a huge problem, and he's authorized an investigation. So there's a bipartisan group of staff, senior staff from Democrats and Republicans, some of these guys have been on the Hill for a very long time. They know what they're doing, and they're investigating this. We have to see where this leads us. If at some point we get stonewalled, the House has subpoena power. We may or may not be able to exercise that depending on what the Democratic leadership and the committee decides. At some point we may need a special prosecutor, but we absolutely have to get to the bottom of this. By the way, these are the same people that are now going to be entrusted to implement Obamacare. this is a huge problem.
Let's move on now to Benghazi, and according to Mrs. Clinton, it doesn't matter anymore because the people died in September of last year. What, various groups are talking about who was responsible, what wasn't happening there. Where do you see that investigation going, and can D.C. handle this many investigations at one time?
Well, I hope we can, because, there too, we still have not gotten a straight answer. Who was it that came up with the idea that we ought to mislead the American people about what happened? Because what we did discover in the testimony in the House from, I thought, very credible witnesses, career diplomats who are not political hacks, these folks were doing their job. And one of them was on the phone with the Secretary of State on the night of the attack. And everybody knew this was a terrorist attack. This was planned, this was methodical, they were well armed with sophisticated hardware. That's not a spontaneous reaction to a video, the way Susan Rice told everybody on national television. So we still haven't gotten the answers to other questions that haunt me, frankly. Why didn't we send American forces, maybe special forces, in to help Americans under attack? And what I hear from the other side sometimes, well, there wouldn't have been time. Well, you only know that after the fact,
Sure.
Because while it's underway, of course, nobody knows how long the attack's going to go on. We don't have all the answers.
Which do you see coming to fruition more when you learn more about the RS or the Benghazi?
We need both. We need answers to both of those.
So it's going to be a long, hot summer of committee meetings.
It could be. Could be.
One of the things that you've been criticized from the conservatives is you worked with Senator from West Virginia,
Joe Manchin,
another pro-gun state,
right,
about the idea of, during the gun control discussion, about background checks.
Right.
A lot of people aren't sure about everything that was in that. They just see it as everybody gets a background check. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
There was a lot of misinformation about that bill, and Steve, I'm a gun owner. I've had an A rating with the NRA my entire career in public office, and I feel very strongly about the Second Amendment. The bill that Joe Manchin and I proposed, oh, and by the way, he's a gun owner, and he's got an A rating, and he feels strongly about the Second Amendment. We came together because I don't believe that a modest effort to keep guns out of the hands of people who have no legal right to have them,
Sure,
namely criminals who forfeit that right, and those who are adjudicated as dangerously mentally ill, that's not gun control, that's common sense. And so what we did is we put together a bill that was actually very similar to a bill that was on the House floor in 1999 in some respects, background checks of commercial gun sales, so sales at gun shows and over the internet piece is new since 1999. But the point is, back in 1999, the NRA endorsed the bill, and Republicans overwhelmingly supported it. I did too, and I think it's the right thing to do. I still do. In my bill with Joe Manchin, we had two other categories, and I should make it clear, the expansion of background checks was built on the existing system that's been in place for decades. No new system would be created. The other part of the bill was to encourage states to provide the information to the background check system, because that's how we determine that's how we learn about people with criminal records and mentally ill. Some states comply very well already, some don't, and we wanted stronger compliance. And then finally, there was a whole list of things that we put into the bill that would allow law-abiding citizens to exercise their Second Amendment rights more freely. So I thought it was a good, sensible piece of legislation. I was just disappointed we couldn't pass it.
At what point will somebody in either the Senate or the House talk about using the laws that are already on the books about existing and actually prosecuting criminals who try and get a gun illegally?
Yeah, and that's a valid criticism, and many of us have pointed that out. That's a valid criticism of this Justice Department, I think. This isn't the first Justice Department that hasn't enforced that. But I will say, I think implicit in the notion of better enforcement of the existing background check system is an acceptance of the background check system. So while yes, we should do a better job enforcing that, I do think it's reasonable to do that couple-of-minute check and on commercial sales, not on individual sales.
And not passing a gun from you to your sons or anything like that?
No, and in fact, this is why we focused exclusively on commercial transactions and left the rest unregulated. So if you wanted to just sell me a handgun that you have now, under Pennsylvania law, that would require a background check. Under this federal law, it wouldn't. If you were to sell your neighbor a shotgun, our law wouldn't require a background check. It would just be gun sales at gun shows and over the internet that would have this background check requirement.
Gotcha. It's a good stopping point for us. When we come back, more with Senator Pat Toomey. You're watching For the Record on WHVL. And welcome back to For the Record in our last segment with Senator Pat Toomey. Senator, you were in the House, now you're in the Senate. Currently, Harry Reid leads the Democratically controlled Senate. John Boehner is the Speaker of the House, led by Republicans. Do you see anything coming through both houses before the 2016 midterm? 2014 midterm. 2014.
Well, sure, there'll be some things that will get done. Hopefully some of the ordinary appropriation bills, ordinary spending bills. And you know, occasionally we do something constructive and then promptly the media will ignore it. For instance, I had helped write a series of bills which ended up becoming the basis for what's known as the Jobs Act.
Sure.
It's a series of provisions that allow small and medium-sized, rapidly growing businesses to raise capital more easily. Fewer regulations, fewer costs, and that helps them to grow. We passed that.
From the average citizen, though, they see all this gridlock between, it's either Republican yes or Democrat yes, Republican no or Democrat no. Is there a way to find that middle ground, which I think most people see themselves politically, in that 40% in the middle as opposed to the 30 on each end?
Yeah, what I think we need to do is look for where there's common ground without sacrificing principles, and that, you know, that's where I'm coming from. You know, it was actually the president appointed a working group, and it was his working group that recommended the regulatory relief that became the basis of the Jobs Act bill. Now, okay, the president proposed it in that sense. That doesn't make it a bad thing, you know, just because he's a Democrat and I'm a Republican. These were good things, so I ran with it. I recruited Democrat co-sponsors, and they saw the wisdom in this, at least most of them did. So that's what I think we ought to be doing is, you know, sure, there's things we're just not going to agree on, but let's find the areas where there might be some common ground.
So there is some chance for some hope, for some resolution for growth.
For some things, yeah. I will tell you, I think in some areas we're very far apart. On fiscal policy, I'm very disappointed.
Sure.
The president seems to be absolutely bound and determined to get yet another huge tax increase. That is not what we need. It is bad for the economy. Our problem is a spending problem. It's not a revenue problem. So I think the president's wrong there.
Right.
And if he insists on sticking to demanding yet another big tax increase, then we're not going to be able to resolve this.
Locally, there's been a lot of talk about Amtrak stopping the Pennsylvania going through the towns like Huntington and Lewistown. Where do you see the future of train travel for passengers? Is there a future with Amtrak, or is it time to look at that, changing the way that
Steve,
Amtrak's
there's a big future for Amtrak, but honestly, I think Amtrak's going to end up having to focus on profitable runs. It's going to have to stick to those corridors where there's enough passenger demand that it covers the cost. Amtrak's broke.
Sure.
Federal government's more broke. So it's nice, and you know, I'd love to have lots of Amtrak service to all kinds of corners of the Commonwealth, but you know, Amtrak's running all over the country, losing money hand over fist. It has one genuinely profitable corridor, maybe a couple of other smaller places, but the Northeast corridor, because there's enough density of population, I think it's got to focus on where it can make some money.
Even more locally, Penn State. A lot of issues still with the ongoing scandal. You and Senator Casey both decided that you would pull the support for Joe Paterno for the Medal of Freedom. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was such a difficult time and a difficult moment. You know, I think some of the things the NCAA did were really very, very unfortunate. The idea, for instance, that we will rewrite history and pretend a lot of victories didn't happen when, of course, they did. It's just wrong. Sure. You know, the history books are what they are. Joe Paterno had those wins. The teams had those wins. Right. At that moment, though, there was still a great deal of controversy swirling around, and I just didn't think it was the right time to go forward with the highest honor that the federal government can give to a civilian. But I think the good news for Penn State is that this is just increasingly getting put behind. And you know, you look at the great job the team is doing. You look at the sold-out Beaver Stadium. You look at an 8-4 record last fall, and that's the football program. The university, of course, is so much more than that, and really doing so well.
Do you see at the end of the tunnel, after all of the other trials have gone about, that there's a chance that maybe you'll think about putting him back in for Medal of Freedom?
At some point, it'll be appropriate to reconsider that. We're probably not at that point yet, and obviously it would have to be posthumously now. But I think it's something it's worth reconsidering.
With the things that have happened at Penn State, locally, you know, the things that happened with the Sandusky trial, and also with the economy. Do you see the federal government pulling back any of its research grants here at the university?
Well, only to the extent that there might be some categories in which there is some reduction in research generally,
But more economic and not as a punishment.
Oh,
towards the
absolutely
university.
not, and I would strongly oppose that. That would be a ridiculous outcome and indefensible.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left, so I want to hit you with some
All
things
right.
real quick. FEMA. You know, the Governor Christie reopened the boardwalk last weekend after the storm there.
Right.
Oklahoma was devastated.
Right.
At what point can the federal government continue to pay for all of these things?
Well,
and where do you find the money to pay for all of these
FEMA
things?
has more than enough money from its last round of funding to cover many multiples of what happened in Oklahoma. As terrible and tragic as that was, in the scheme of things, it was, you know, the nature of tornadoes, they're very, very concentrated.
Okay.
And so the dollar sum is something that FEMA can easily afford out of its existing budget.
I have to talk a little political with you if I can for
All
the
right.
last minute while we're on. Bob Dole says that the GOP should close for repairs. What are your thoughts on that?
Close for repairs.
Close for repairs.
The party that took control of the House in 2010 and had huge gains in the Senate in 2010 and narrowly lost, frankly, a presidential in 2012. We don't need to close for repairs. I disagree with Senator Dole on that. I don't think we need to change who we are. I think we can do a better job recruiting candidates in some cases. We can run better campaigns, and we need to do that. And we need to sometimes find a better way to communicate conservative principles in terms of practical outcomes. How do they help make people's lives better? If we do that, we're going to do just fine as a party.
Now, also politically, you said you're only leaning towards maybe running for one more term. Why? You have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Look, I think we're better off with a Congress of citizen legislators. I pledged to serve only 3 terms in the House. That's what I did. I don't regret that decision. I'd like to serve a second term in the Senate, so I probably will run for one more term. If the voters decide to send me back, I will have served 12 years in the Senate, 6 years in the House, 18 years of my life. That will have been enough.
We have to stop there, Senator. Thank you very much. You've been watching WHVL's For the Record. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.